Right now, in your refrigerator, there's a carton of milk that roughly 2 out of every 3 adults on the planet cannot fully digest. Not because milk is inherently bad for humans, but because most human bodies stop producing the enzyme needed to break down its sugar somewhere around childhood. And yet there's another milk sitting on a much smaller, much more expensive shelf in the same grocery store that's measurably easier on the human gut. Smaller fat molecules, less of the sugar that causes the problem in the first place, less of the protein responsible for most milk allergies. It comes from an animal that needs less land, less water, and less feed per pound of body weight than a dairy cow. And almost nobody in the West drinks it. That milk is goat milk. And the gap between what it should cost and what it actually costs is not small. A gallon of cow milk runs you $3 to $5 at a typical American grocery store. A gallon of goat milk can run $8 to $15, sometimes more. That's not a slight premium. That's 2 to 3 times the price for a product that, on paper, solves a digestive problem affecting the majority of the human species. So why hasn't the easier to digest milk taken over? Why does a country with more lactose intolerance than most of Europe still build its entire dairy industry around the one animal least suited to that problem? Some people will tell you it's about taste or availability, or that goat milk is just a niche health food trend. There's a piece of truth buried in each of those answers, but the explanation runs through a 10,000-year-old animal from the Fertile Crescent, a single number about how much milk one animal can produce compared to another, and a law on the books in 3 American states that single out goat milk for special legal treatment, 2 of them requiring a written note from a doctor before you're legally allowed to buy it. The goat never stopped being a genuinely capable dairy animal. What changed was which animal the modern food system decided to build itself around, and why digestion barely factored into that decision at all. 10,000 years before cattle, long before anyone was arguing about lactose, there was a wild goat called the bezoar, roaming the mountains of what's now southeastern Turkey and western Iran. Here's the thing that makes this section worth sitting through. This same animal would go on to lose a 5 or 6 to 1 production race it had no real chance of winning, and that gap is what actually sets the price tag on your grocery shelf. But to understand why that gap opened up, you have to go back to the very beginning of this animal's relationship with humans. The bezoar grazed steep, rocky terrain that most other animals couldn't handle, moved in tight herds, and had one trait that made it unusually easy for early humans to work with. It tolerated close contact. Around 10 to 11,000 years ago, in the same region known as the Fertile Crescent, people started keeping bezoar goats close to their settlements instead of just hunting them. Genetic research on ancient goat remains shows this wasn't one clean moment of domestication. It happened in overlapping waves, with different human groups capturing and breeding wild goats across the region over centuries, gradually shaping one wild species into what would become one of the very first domesticated animals in human history. By the time cattle joined the picture in most regional timelines, goats had already been living alongside humans for generations. That timing matters for a reason. Most people rarely connect to their own biology, and it's the reason your body handles milk the way it does today. As humans in different parts of the world started keeping dairy animals, a genetic mutation that let adults keep digesting lactose into adulthood started spreading, but only in the specific populations that had built their food systems around milk. Northern Europeans developed high rates of lactose tolerance because their ancestors leaned hard into cattle dairying. Populations in East Asia and much of Africa, where dairying either arrived later or didn't become central to the diet, largely didn't. That's the biological hinge this whole story turns on. Milk tolerance isn't a fixed human trait. It's a regional adaptation that lines up almost exactly with which animal a given culture happened to build its dairy tradition around. Goats spread out of the Middle East for thousands of years, moving with traders, herders, and eventually colonizers, showing up everywhere from the Mediterranean to the mountains of South Asia to the arid stretches of North Africa. They arrived in North America the same way most livestock did, brought over by European settlers in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spanish explorers and missionaries brought goats into the American Southwest. English colonists brought milking goats to Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. The animal had already crossed an ocean and a continent before the United States existed as a country. But this is where the goat story splits from almost every other domesticated dairy animal, and that divergence decides everything that follows. Formal organized dairy goat breeding in the United States didn't really begin until 1904, when a handful of breeders started forming small clubs to standardize and improve breeds like the Saanen and the Nubian. These weren't corporations. They were individual farmers, often working with a few dozen animals at most, focused on breed quality rather than production volume. Picture one of these early breeders, a farmer in a barn with 15 or 20 goats, hand-milking each one twice a day, keeping detailed notes on which doe produced the richest milk, entering animals in regional shows where judges evaluated conformation and pedigree rather than gallons per day. Now picture the other type of dairy operation that was starting to take shape around the same time. Just a few states over, rows of dairy cows standing in mechanized milking parlors, each animal hooked up to equipment designed to extract as much milk as possible, as fast as possible, from a breed selectively bred for exactly that purpose. One of these paths led toward industrial scale. The other simply didn't. Not because the goat was a lesser animal, but because nobody ever tried to build a machine like that around it in the first place. That difference, one animal getting the industrial treatment and one left without it, is the starting point for the yield gap that drives up what goat milk costs today. The number nobody talks about. There's one number that explains almost everything else in this video. A modern dairy cow, over a single lactation cycle, can produce somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 liters of milk. A good dairy goat, over that same stretch of time, produces roughly 1,800 to 2,000 liters. Put those side by side, and one cow is doing the work of 5 or 6 goats. That gap alone would be enough to account for why cow milk dominates grocery shelves. But the story gets worse for the goat, in a way that runs against what most people assume. You'd expect the animal that needs less land and less infrastructure to also need less feed per gallon of milk it produces. That's certainly true in the pigeon and duck stories, where the free-ranging animal wins the feed efficiency argument even as it loses on price. Goats break that pattern. Estimates from dairy extension programs put a goat's feed requirement at roughly 24 pounds for every gallon of milk it produces, compared to roughly 8 pounds of feed per gallon for a dairy cow. The goat isn't just producing less milk per animal, it's also converting the feed it does eat into milk less efficiently than a cow does. Stack those two numbers together and the price tag stops being a mystery. Goat milk doesn't cost more because it needs exotic ingredients or delicate handling that cow milk doesn't. It costs more because every single gallon of goat milk requires more animals, more feeding, more milking sessions, and more labor hours than the equivalent gallon of cow milk. A dairy operation built around cows produces more product per worker, per acre, and per dollar of feed than one built around goats. And that gap compounds at every stage of the supply chain, from the farm to the processing plant to the truck that delivers it to your store. Zoom out to a global scale and the imbalance becomes almost absurd. Worldwide, cow milk production runs somewhere around 500 million tons a year. Goat milk production, across every goat-keeping country on Earth, adds up to somewhere around 19 million tons. Cow milk outproduces goat milk by more than 25 times over, on a planet where goats have had just as long, arguably longer, to prove themselves as a dairy animal. This didn't happen because someone ran the numbers in 1904 and decided goats weren't worth the investment. It happened because cattle breeding, feed science, and dairy equipment all got optimized around cow physiology for a century, while goat dairying stayed just about where it started. Small, decentralized, and built around individual farmers rather than industrial supply chains. Once that gap opened up, it fed itself. More investment went toward cow dairy infrastructure, because cows were already more productive, which made cows even more productive relative to goats, which justified even more investment in cow infrastructure. The goat had no real chance to close that gap because the entire system was built to reward exactly the trait cows already had, and goats didn't. That settles the question this video opened with. It was never really about digestion. It's about the fact that a cow can outproduce a goat 5 to 6 times over, on top of using feed more efficiently. And once an industry is chasing volume above everything else, that math wins every time. If videos like this, ones that dig into the hidden economics behind the food in your kitchen, are what you're here for, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Because the price gap is only half of this story. The other half involves a state law that treats goat milk almost like a controlled substance. The price gap at the register. You already know the numbers from the top of this video. Cow milk sitting at $3 to $5 a gallon, goat milk starting around $8 and climbing past $20 for an organic or small batch label. What you don't know yet is why that gap exists at all. The part that makes the gap even stranger is this. At the farm gate, before any processing or markup happens, goat milk isn't dramatically more expensive to produce than cow milk. Wholesale prices for raw goat milk typically land around $4.50 to $5 a gallon, which isn't far off from what a dairy farmer gets paid for cow milk at that same stage. The jump happens after the milk leaves the farm. Cow milk moves through a processing system built for enormous volume. A single cow dairy can supply enough raw milk to keep a bottling line running efficiently for hours at a time, spreading the cost of pasteurization, packaging, and transport across thousands of gallons. Goat dairies operate at a fraction of that scale, which means the same processing equipment, the same trucks, and the same retail shelf space have to be paid for across a much smaller volume of product. Every fixed cost in the system gets divided by a much smaller number of gallons, and that difference shows up directly on the price sticker. So the price you pay at the register reflects how small the industry making goat milk still is, compared to the machine built around the cow, not how expensive the milk actually is to make. The digestion truth. Before going any further, it's worth saying clearly, goat milk is not lactose-free. If you're severely lactose intolerant, a glass of goat milk will still cause the same bloating, cramping, and discomfort a glass of cow milk would. Anyone telling you otherwise is overselling it. So if the science doesn't back up goat milk has no lactose, what's actually behind its reputation as the easier to digest option? The actual explanation comes down to 3 separate, distinct differences, and only one of them involves lactose at all. First, the lactose itself. Goat milk contains roughly 4.2% lactose, compared to somewhere between 4.7 and 5% in cow milk. That's a measurable difference, but a modest one, somewhere in the range of 10 to 16% less. It's not enough to make goat milk safe for someone with a severe intolerance, but it is enough to explain why people with a milder sensitivity often report fewer symptoms. Second, and more significant, is the structure of the fat itself. Goat milk's fat globules are naturally smaller and more evenly distributed than the fat globules in cow milk. Cow milk typically needs to be mechanically homogenized to break its fat down into a consistent, easily digestible texture. Goat milk arrives from the animal already closer to that state. Smaller fat particles break down faster in the digestive tract, which is a completely separate mechanism from lactose and one that has nothing to do with intolerance at all. Third, and this is the piece almost nobody separates out correctly, is protein. Cow milk contains a protein fraction called alpha S1 casein, which is one of the most common triggers behind milk protein allergies, a completely different condition from lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance is a sugar digestion problem. A milk protein allergy is an immune system reaction. Goat milk contains significantly less of that specific casein fraction, which is why some people who react badly to cow milk, not because of lactose, but because of an actual protein allergy, tolerate goat milk without the same reaction. Conflating those two conditions is exactly how goat milk is easier to digest turned into an oversimplified marketing line instead of the nuanced biological explanation it actually deserves. That protein difference has a real-world payoff beyond the theory. Pediatricians increasingly point families toward goat milk-based infant formula when a baby reacts poorly to standard cow milk formula, not as a lactose fix, but as a workaround for a specific casein sensitivity that has nothing to do with sugar digestion at all. The same distinction quietly drives a corner of the pet food industry too, where goat milk supplements get marketed to dogs with sensitive stomachs for that exact protein-based reason, years before most humans ever heard the phrase easier to digest applied to their own kitchen. Now, the myth that usually comes packaged with all of this. The idea that goat milk inherently tastes goaty, musky, or off compared to cow milk. That reputation is almost entirely a handling issue, not a trait of the milk itself. Goat milk picks up strong odors and flavors easily, especially if a milking doe is kept in close proximity to a buck during breeding season, or if the milk isn't cooled quickly enough after milking. Properly handled goat milk, cooled fast and kept away from bucks, tastes clean, mild, and only subtly different from cow milk, which is exactly what you'll find in most commercially produced goat milk sold today. The bad reputation comes from decades of small-scale, inconsistent handling long before refrigeration and modern dairy practices became standard, not from anything wrong with the animal or its milk. So the honest version of this claim isn't about lactose at all. Goat milk solves a slightly different, more specific set of digestive problems than most people realize. Smaller fat particles, less of a specific allergy-triggering protein, wrapped in flavor baggage that has little to do with the milk itself. The doctor's note, Law 1 detail in this story sounds almost made up, except it isn't. In parts of the United States, it is illegal to walk into a store and simply buy raw goat milk, not because it's banned outright, but because in states like Kentucky and Rhode Island, you legally need a written prescription from a physician before a seller can hand it over to you. The same document you'd need for a controlled medication is, in these two states, a legal requirement for a glass of unpasteurized goat milk. To understand how strange that is, you have to understand how messy raw milk law is in general. The federal government bans the sale of raw milk across state lines entirely, and advises states not to allow it within their own borders either. But dairy regulation in the US has always been left largely to individual states, which means the actual rules vary wildly depending on where you happen to be standing. Some states ban raw milk sales completely. Some allow direct farm sales only. Some allow retail sales with permits and inspections. And scattered through that patchwork are rules that treat goat milk specifically, differently from cow milk. Oregon is the clearest example, and it runs in the exact opposite direction from what you'd expect. Oregon allows raw goat and sheep milk to be sold at retail stores, but bans raw cow milk from being sold that same way. If you wanted a bottle of unpasteurized milk from a retail shelf in Oregon, goat milk is the legal option, and cow milk is the one that isn't. Meanwhile, in Arkansas and Oklahoma, raw goat milk sales are capped at specific monthly volume limits per farm, a restriction that doesn't apply the same way to cow milk in those states. In South Carolina, off-farm retail raw milk sales are permitted for goat milk specifically, not cow milk. Mississippi belongs in this same small club of states, though its version is lighter touch. It allows small-scale, on-farm raw goat milk sales, capped at roughly 9 lactating goats, without the physician's note requirement Kentucky and Rhode Island impose. These laws aren't random. They're the fossilized remains of a decades-old assumption that goat milk carries a form of medicinal legitimacy that cow milk hadn't earned in the same way, an assumption baked into actual statute by lawmakers who, at some point, decided goat milk needed a doctor's involvement in a way cow milk simply didn't. Whether or not that assumption ever had solid medical grounding, it's still sitting in state law books today, quietly treating one animal's milk as closer to medicine than food. So the price gap at the grocery store isn't the only place goat milk gets treated as something other than an ordinary dairy product. In a handful of states, the legal system agrees, and it's written the difference directly into law. If you've made it this far, and you're someone who actually wants to know why the world works the way it does, instead of just accepting it, subscribe now. Because the last piece of this story is about the places on Earth where none of this confusion exists at all, and goat milk needs no doctor's note to be treated as exactly what it is. The quiet exceptions step outside the United States, and the entire premise of this video starts to look backward. On most of the planet, goat milk carries no boutique health product label at all. It's just milk. India and Bangladesh alone are home to the largest goat populations kept for milk anywhere in the world, with tens of millions of dairy goats between them. And together they account for close to half of all the fresh goat milk produced globally. In large parts of rural India, a family goat is a far more practical dairy animal than a cow. It eats less, survives on scrubland and kitchen scraps that would starve a cow, needs no barn, and can be managed by a single person with almost no infrastructure. For a household with a small plot of land and no capital to invest in cattle, a goat is simply the animal that fits the resources actually available, not a downgrade from a cow. The Mediterranean tells a similar story, just dressed up differently. Greek feta has traditionally been made from a blend of sheep and goat milk for centuries, long before it became an export product with a protected name. In France, goat cheese, chèvre, functions as a regional identity rather than a niche import, with entire towns in the Loire Valley built around specific styles of goat cheese that carry the same protected geographic status the French give their wines. Nobody in a French farmer's market treats goat cheese as an alternative to something else. It's simply one of the standard products on the table, sitting next to the cow cheese without any implied hierarchy between them. Across much of Africa and the Middle East, the same logic that makes goats practical in rural India applies just as directly. Goats are browsers, not grazers, meaning they eat leaves, shrubs, and rough vegetation that cattle can't survive on. That makes them the default dairy animal in arid and semi-arid regions where cows simply don't have enough to eat. In places where land quality dictates which animal you can keep at all, the choice wasn't really between a premium milk and a regular one. It was between having dairy at all or not, and the goat was almost always the animal that made the difference. Put all of that together and a clear pattern emerges. Everywhere the industrial cow dairy system didn't fully take hold, goats simply stayed the practical, everyday dairy animal they'd always been. The doctor's note laws, the health food store pricing, the easier-to-digest marketing language. None of that exists in places where goat milk stayed at the center of the table in the first place. The strangeness belongs entirely to the one part of the world that built its dairy system around a different animal, and then forgot that any other option had ever been normal. The goat was never the problem. Closer. The goat never changed. It's the same animal it was 10,000 years ago in the mountains of the Fertile Crescent. Hardy, adaptable, capable of surviving on land that would starve a cow, and producing a milk that's measurably gentler on a huge share of the human digestive system. That was just as true a century ago as it is now. What changed was which animal an entire industrial food system decided to organize itself around. And once that decision got made, sometime in the early 20th century, on farms that had no idea they were setting a permanent trajectory, everything downstream followed automatically. The yield gap decided the price. The price decided the shelf space. The shelf space decided which milk became the default in 1 billion American kitchens, and which one got quietly filed away as a health food specialty item, wrapped in marketing language that oversells what it actually does. Even the law caught up to that story eventually, treating one animal's milk as something closer to medicine, requiring a doctor's signature in 2 states as if drinking it needed permission. The other milk simply didn't. Not because anyone ever proved goat milk was dangerous, but because an old assumption that goat milk was somehow more medicinal, more delicate, more in need of oversight than cow milk, got written into statute and simply stayed on the books. Digestion, flavor, and safety were beside the point the whole time. The only thing that mattered was which animal could be scaled the fastest, and once that race had a winner, the loser's actual biology and its actual usefulness to the people who need it most stopped mattering to the system that built itself around the other option. So this is the question worth sitting with. The goat isn't the only case like this. Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there's probably another food that got filed away as expensive, or niche, or medicinal, not because of anything true about the food itself, but because a century ago, some other option happened to scale faster, and the story simply calcified around whichever animal or plant or ingredient won that race first. The facts didn't decide what ended up in your fridge. The economics did, generations ago, and the story just never got updated. If this changed how you think about the milk in your own kitchen, hit subscribe, because this channel exists specifically to dig up the hidden economics behind the ordinary things you eat without ever questioning why. And if you want to see this exact pattern play out again, somewhere even stranger, the next video is waiting for you right now.